In the far-off corner of the galaxy where stars glowed like fireflies, and the sky stretched wide over endless golden fields, there lived a boy named Leo and a girl named Mira. Their colony was small, just a cluster of low-built homes carved from native stone with gardens of edible moss and trees brought from Earth long ago. People on this planet lived simple lives, growing food, collecting rainwater, and following the slow seasons of twin suns that circled above like watchful parents. Leo was curious by nature, always climbing rocks, chasing light bugs, drawing ships in the dirt with a stick, and asking questions the grown-ups did not have time to answer. Mira, on the other hand, was quiet and careful, her steps soft, her thoughts deep. Like the lakes that dotted the hills beyond their settlement, she spent most of her time helping her grandmother in the herb house, learning the names of healing roots and the rhythm of life on their planet. Two had been close since they could walk, sharing meals, chasing wine beasts that floated low over the grass, whispering secrets under starlight. Their favorite place was the old observation tower, a rusty relic from the first surveyors who came to the planet decades ago. Now it was nothing more than a hollow shell, but it stood tall above the fields, and from there they could watch the moons rise together every 7th evening. The view made them feel like they were floating far above their tiny world. One evening, as they sat shoulder to shoulder on the tower platform, watching the silver moon climb into the sky, Leo turned to Mira with serious eyes and said words that would echo for years to come. He said, "When I grow up, I will marry you." Mira blinked, not knowing whether to laugh or blush, but something in his voice told her he meant it more than a passing joke, more than a child's fantasy. She smiled and replied, "Maybe I will wait for you then." Neither of them knew what waited beyond the horizon, for their colony tensions had been growing between Earth's outer systems and the alliance of alien species known as the Haldron Accord. Colonies like theirs were left vulnerable, cut off from central command, while the fleet moved to more strategic locations only a week. After that night, the peace shattered without warning. A low roar filled the sky as military ships descended like shadows over the fields. Emergency alarms screamed across the settlement. The adults ran in all directions, packing essentials and guiding children toward the waiting transports. Leo was pulled away by his father, who had received urgent orders from the fleet command. Mira stood at the edge of the clearing near the old well house, her eyes wide and unblinking as she saw Leo being loaded into the shuttle, his small hands gripping the edge of the hatch. One last time, he called her name. She heard it through the noise and wind. Then he shouted, "Wait for me," and the hatch closed before she could reply. The engines ignited, a wave of dust rolled across the fields, and the shuttle lifted into the sky, carrying Leo into the stars. That was the last time anyone saw him for years. Life on the colony changed after that. The skies remained quiet, the communication towers stopped blinking, and the regular supply drops never came. Mira's grandmother told her the war had swallowed the stars, and it was better to keep their heads down. The people adapted, ration supplies grew stronger together, but the silence from Earth was louder than any sound. Mira kept going. She worked in the gardens, helped rebuild homes, treated wounds when accidents happened, and in her private moments, she sat alone on the tower where the paint had long since peeled, where the metal creaked when the wind passed, and watched the moons as they rose, just like they used to when she and Leo were small. Years passed, and Mira became a woman. Her hair grew long, her hands rough from labor, her voice calm like running water. She stopped talking about Leo to others, but never stopped thinking of him. She wondered if he remembered, if he was still alive, if he had been caught in the fires of war, or if maybe, just maybe, he was out there waiting for the right moment to return. But deep down in the quiet part of her heart where her childhood still whispered, she held on to the promise, not because it was grand or magical, but because it was simple, honest, and full of light in a world that had lost so much of it. She never married, though many kind men asked. She always said she had too much work, or that the timing wasn't right. No one questioned her too much because Mira had become the soul of the colony, a healer, A listener, a quiet strength that others leaned on, and far away beyond the reach of her world. In a place she had never seen, Leo was still alive. He had not forgotten either, even as he endured the cold metal walls of prison labs, even as strange beings tried to reshape his mind, even as he was pushed and pulled through pain and control and loneliness. He kept her memory like a flame buried deep inside, untouched by the darkness around him. He remembered her face, her laugh, the way the wind caught her hair, and above all, the night. He made a promise beneath two moons. He had lost track of time but not of purpose. And one day, when the stars realigned and the road back home opened again, he would return, not just to see her, not just to say he survived, but to finish what he started with the same heart that once belonged to a boy who sat on a tower and said, "I will marry you when I grow up." That day was coming closer with every beat of his heart. Mira woke before the sun most mornings, her hands moving with practiced ease as she gathered herbs from the garden behind the old clinic. Her grandmother once ran the air cool and damp around her feet. The soil, dark and rich with memory, life on the colony had grown quiet over the years, steady like the pulse of the planet itself. The people no longer asked about news from Earth or distant systems. They had stopped waiting for ships to arrive or for the sky to change. Instead, learned to live with what they had and found ways to survive in silence. War had taken more than just people, it had taken their connection to the greater universe. It had turned their quiet colony into a forgotten corner, a place that seemed to exist outside of time, and Mira had become part of that rhythm, moving through her days with calm strength, offering help when others fell ill, lifting children from muddy paths, showing young ones how to mend broken fences. She never asked for anything, in return her presence enough to bring comfort to those around her. And yet when the night came and the stars filled the sky, when the others had gone to sleep and the world slowed, Mira often found herself returning to the old tower, the same one where she and Leo once watched the moons rise. The tower was now more rust than metal, and its stairs creaked with every step, but she climbed it still, sometimes with a basket of dried herbs, sometimes with nothing at all, except the echo of a voice she had not heard in years. Would sit at the edge, her legs dangling into the cool air, her eyes tracing the familiar arc of the moons as they rose side by side across the sky. And in those quiet hours, she would remember the promise a child once made, and wonder where he was, whether he had become the man he hoped to be, whether he still carried her name in his heart, or if time had taken that from him, just as it had taken so much else. Some of the older colonists believed Leo had perished along with the others on that shuttle. The ship was never listed among confirmed survivors, and no transmissions ever came from its crew. Others thought he might have been captured or lost in the outer systems. Mira did not speak of her thoughts to anyone, but deep within she believed something different. She believed that if he were gone, she would know it. She would feel it in the place where his words still lived inside her, the place where the memory of his smile had not faded. Meanwhile, far beyond the colony, light years away, Leo moved through corridors lit by cold blue light, his body stronger, now faster than before, his eyes sharper, his muscles taut and precise. But his soul remained untouched. He remembered who he was, even when others tried to strip it from him. The facility he had been taken to was hidden deep within the boundaries of what used to be neutral space, an underground research station run by a shadow group formed in the chaos of war, part alien, part human. Its goal was control, not peace. They told him he had been selected, told him he was lucky to be part of a new future, told him his mind would be expanded and his body improved, but they had no idea how strong his will was. They could shape his reflexes, alter his chemistry, give him speed, strength, stamina beyond what any child from a farming colony should have possessed, but they could not change the core of who he was. Each time they tried to rewrite his memory, Mira would return stronger than before, her face, her voice, her presence like a lighthouse in the storm. Each time he was tested, each time he was pushed beyond pain and fear, he would remember her laughter under starlight, her hands brushing dust from her skirt, Her soft reply, maybe I will wait for you then. Leo learned their systems, their protocols, their weaknesses. He watched, listened, trained, and waited. Just as she waited, he gathered what he could, stored knowledge behind. False compliance wore their mask until it no longer fit, until the cracks began to show, and one day when an opportunity finally came, he slipped through their hands like water, vanishing into the void with only one goal: return home. Not to hide, not to run, but to finish what he started. Back on the colony, life continued. Mira trained. Young medics showed them how to listen with more than ears, how to touch with care, how to read symptoms hidden behind tired eyes. The children adored her, the elders respected her, and yet no one knew how much weight she carried, how many times she had stood on the tower and whispered promises to the wind. Promises she had no way of keeping, promises made to a boy whose name she still spoke in her heart. And then one morning, as the first light crept over the hills, a sound echoed across the fields that had not been heard in more than a decade, a low humming followed by a ripple in the air. The people looked up, shielding their eyes, and there, in the sky above the wheat fields, a ship approached. Not a warship, not one of the old cargo haulers, but something sleek, smooth, silver, and unfamiliar. It slowed above the central square, rotating gently until it landed without sound, its engines falling silent, like a breath held in reverence. Stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, her pulse steady but her heart pounding, her eyes fixed on the door. As it hissed open, a soft white mist spilling out, and for a moment, there was only silence, the kind that stretches across years and pain and memory. And then a figure stepped out. Tall, dressed in a simple cloak, his face hidden by the hood, but his steps measured and unafraid. And as he reached the foot of the ramp, he stopped, pulled back the hood, and looked at Mira. His eyes met hers, and in that instant she knew, before he even spoke, before anyone else understood. She knew it was Leo, not the boy who made a promise, but the man who had come to keep it. And though she did not move, though the crowd began to whisper, her world had already shifted, because he had returned, and the silence was finally broken. Leo stood still at the base of the ship, his eyes locked with Mira's, as if all the years that had passed between them had collapsed into a single breath. The crowd remained silent, unsure of what to say, unsure of who this man was, but Mira knew without question. Her heart recognized him. Even though the features of his face had matured, even though his body held the weight of long struggle, and his eyes carried shadows from places she could never imagine, he was Leo, not just in name but in soul and spirit. And every silent moment they had shared before she stepped forward slowly, her feet moving before her mind could catch up. And when she reached him, she did not speak. Her hand rose gently, and he took it without hesitation. And in that brief touch the years fell away, and they were once again two children sitting on the tower, dreaming under moons and whispering promises to each other, before the war, before the silence, before the world turned heavy. The crowd began to stir, whispers turned into questions, but Leo raised his other hand and calmly asked to speak with the council, not with the guards, not with the officials, not with any outside authority, but with the people who had remained, the keepers of the colony during the long years of quiet. Mira nodded and led him through familiar paths. Lined with curious eyes and cautious hearts, they reached the council hall, a stone building built by their ancestors, reinforced many times, but still bearing the marks of time and memory inside. Leo removed his cloak, revealing a simple uniform, not of Earth's current military, not of any known faction, but stitched with unfamiliar threads, glowing faintly at the seams. And the council members exchanged uncertain glances, but remained quiet as he began to speak, his voice steady and clear, shaped by years of silence and survival. He told them where he had been, not in full detail, for the pain still lingered in his throat, but enough to show that he had not been lost or idle. He spoke of the research facility hidden in the outer systems, a place run by a covert alliance of species who saw humanity not as a threat, but as a subject to be studied, altered, shaped. He spoke of others who had been taken like him, some who had forgotten themselves, some who had changed beyond recognition, and some who had not survived the long years of testing and manipulation. Mayra listened, her fingers folded tightly in her lap, her breath calm, but her heart aching with every word. She knew now that his return was not just a miracle, but a risk. He carried secrets, not meant to reach the colony, secrets that powerful forces would not want exposed. He reached into a pouch at his side and placed a small device on the council table, a flat crystal pad containing data logs, images and recordings stolen from the facility, enough to expose the program, enough to make others afraid. Council hesitated, unsure whether to believe, unsure what to do with such knowledge. They asked why he brought this to them and not to Central Command. Why risk everything to return to a forgotten colony? Leo's answer was simple. This is where I made my promise, and I will not run from it. Not now, not ever. Outside. The sun had climbed higher, casting golden light across the valley. The colony returned to its daily rhythm, but the news of Leo's story spread quickly. Whispers passed from home to home, from field to field. Some were fearful, some inspired, some skeptical, but all were affected by the idea that their little world had become part of something far greater than they knew. Ira walked with Leo to the tower, the one place untouched by change. It still stood tall, though age had taken much of its strength. Its steps creaked beneath their weight, but neither hesitated, and when they reached the top, the wind caught her hair just as it used to, and he stood beside her just as before, only now taller, stronger, and marked by everything he had faced and survived. He spoke quietly, then, not of war, not of science, not of pain, but of memory. He told her how he had kept her voice in his mind through every test, every sleepless night, every lie told to him, how her face had reminded him who he was when they tried to rewrite his thoughts, how the promise he made under these very moons had become his anchor, his reason for resisting, his reason for living. Mayra did not interrupt. She simply listened, because she knew that his return was not just the end of a journey, but the beginning of something deeper, something that neither time, nor distance, nor suffering could erase. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box carved from alloy, not the cold, sterile metal of the lab, but something warm with a soft sheen, shaped with care and patience. He opened it to reveal a ring, simple, elegant, and handcrafted. Its surface engraved with tiny lines that shimmered when touched by light. He held it out to her with no grand speech, no dramatic gesture, only a quiet look that said everything she needed to know. The years had taken much from both of them, but they had not taken this. They had not taken the truth behind a child's vow, or the strength that carried through the silence of war. Mayra took the ring, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of all that had passed, all that had been endured, all that still remained to face. She looked into his eyes and found not a stranger, not a soldier, not a survivor, but the same Leo who once drew stars in the dirt and told her he would marry her someday. Down below, the colony continued its work, unaware that on top of that old tower, a chapter was closing and a new one had begun. The sky above the colony was clear that morning, but the air felt different. A stillness had settled across the valley, not the calm of peace, but the pause before something unknown. Mayra stood near the council house, her eyes scanning the horizon, her thoughts moving faster than the breeze that rustled the golden fields below her feet. Beside her, Leo spoke quietly with two elders, showing them more of what he had brought: the data in the crystal pad, the records, the names, the genetic files, and the plans hidden beneath layers of alien encryption. Some of the elders shook their heads in disbelief, others leaned in closer, unable to look away from what they saw. The truth was heavier than anyone expected. The war that had pulled Leo away from the colony so many years ago had not only been a conflict of territory and resources, it had been the beginning of a hidden experiment, an attempt by a shadow faction within the Haldren Accord to study the limits of human will by separating selected children from remote colonies, isolating them and exposing them to engineered conditions. They wanted to see how far a human mind could bend without breaking, how far love, memory, loyalty could be stretched before it disappeared. Leo had been one of those selected, not randomly, but carefully his background, his age, his personality, and most of all the promise he made that night under the moons. They had watched him from afar long before the shuttle came. For him, they had chosen him because they believed the human heart was nothing more than a pattern, something that could be cracked, studied, copied, but they were wrong. Mira listened as Leo explained how he had hidden his resistance, how he had tricked their tests, and protected the memory of her voice by burying it deep beneath false thoughts, how he had turned their technology against them, using their own tools to send silent signals to distant satellites that one day reached a listening ship. That ship did not belong to Earth, nor to any known force. It belonged to a breakaway fleet of humans who had escaped the war and created their own path, and they had found Leo broken, but alive and ready to return. Now that he was here, now that he had revealed what was done, the question was what would come next. The council feared that releasing this information could bring destruction, that the same shadow force might still be watching, that the colony might be targeted if the truth spread too far. Mira stood and told them that hiding would not save them, that truth kept in silence was no different from a lie. Leo placed the crystal pad on the center table and activated the beacon inside it. A signal shot upward, invisible to the naked eye, a message sent to the nearest Earth-aligned network. Within hours, the response came not in the form of words but in motion. A ship appeared on their outer radar, sleek, fast armed, not a warship, but a diplomatic cruiser traveling under a protective flag. It requested permission to land, and the council agreed, unsure of what else to do, unsure if they were welcoming allies or inviting judgment. The ship touched down in the far field, and from its ramp emerged a woman dressed in white and gray, her face calm, her voice careful. She introduced herself as Leah, a neutral observer from the Interstellar Accord, and she requested to speak with Leo. Alone they walked together to the tower where the moons had not yet risen, where the wind still whispered through the cracked metal beams, and Mira followed a short distance behind, not because she feared for him, but because something about this Leia did not sit right. As they reached the top, Leah turned her eyes on Leo and told him that his data had confirmed suspicions long denied, that the factions behind his captivity were now being hunted, dismantled, erased by forces far beyond this world. But then she said something that changed the air around them. She told him there were more like him scattered across colonies, still hidden, still carrying pieces of what he carried, and that Earth's Central Command wanted to bring him back, not to honor his strength, but to study it, to replicate it, to use his experience to build something new. Leo looked at her and said he had not returned, for that he had not endured years of silence, just to become another project, another tool in someone else's war. He said he had returned because of a promise, because of Mira, because this place was where he found the part of himself they could never take, and he would not leave it behind now, not for any reward, not for any power. Leah's expression did not change, but something in her voice turned colder. She warned him that refusing would bring consequences, that Earth was no longer the place he remembered, and that those in command did not take kindly to rebellion. Leo stepped closer and told her that if they came for him, they would find him waiting, but not alone. Behind him, Mira stepped forward, her voice calm and unwavering. She said that if Leo was forced to leave, then she would go too, and so would others, that this colony was not weak and not forgotten, and that if the price of protecting their own was to stand against the giants beyond the stars, then they would stand without fear, because they had already survived the silence, and they had already lived without rescue. Leah paused, and then nodded once she said the message was received. And she left without another word, her ship lifting silently back into the sky, disappearing just as quickly as it came. But the threat remained, the knowledge that more eyes were now watching the colony, that forces larger than them had turned their gaze toward this quiet place. That night, as the moons rose once more, Mira and Leo returned to the tower, not to speak of war or fear or politics, but to sit together in the place where everything began. They watched the light spill over the hills. They listened to the wind, and they said nothing for a long time, because some moments are not made for words, Some moments carry their own weight in that silence. Leo reached into his coat once more, not for data, not for weapons, but for something he had carried since the day he escaped the ring, not of gold or silver, but of forged memory shaped by his hands. During long nights alone, a promise not forgotten, a future not surrendered, and as he turned to Mira, she saw not the soldier, not the survivor, but the boy who once looked up at the stars and believed that love could survive anything. And she knew then that whatever came next, they would face it together, not as children, not as victims, not as symbols of a broken system, but as two hearts that had found their way home, through fire, through silence, through the endless dark of space. Wind was soft that morning, as if the planet itself had taken a long breath and now exhaled in peace. The fields moved in waves, golden light rolling over them like tides, and the sky above the colony was clean, wide, and open. Leo stood near the edge of the eastern hill where the grass grew tall and the ground sloped gently toward the distant river behind him. The people of the colony had gathered quietly, not because they were forced, not because they had been called, but because something in their hearts pulled them there, as if they knew that what was about to happen would belong not just to two people, but to all of them. Mira walked toward him, dressed not in ceremony, not in pretense, but in the simple cloth she always wore, soft blue, touched with pale silver, her hair woven back with a single thread of grass. Just as she used to do when she was a child. There was no music, no drums, no voice raised in song, but the silence between them carried more weight than any spoken words. Leo turned and saw her approach, his face calm, his eyes steady, but within him a fire stirred, not of anger, not of fear, but of something deeper. A warmth that had waited for too long, a promise that had reached its day. Stepped forward and held out his hand, and she took it, and together they stood beneath the wide sky, not as strangers, not as survivors, but as the boy and girl who once dreamed. Under twin moons, the same moons that now hung above them, one silver, one faint blue, just like all those years ago, when time was still soft and the future unwritten. Leo looked at her and spoke, not to the crowd, not to the stars, but to the girl who never forgot, to the woman who waited not in sorrow, but in strength. He told her that everything he had endured had led to this moment, that through pain and silence and darkness, her memory had been the only truth that remained untouched. He told her that when he had nothing else, when hope had thinned to a thread, her name had been his anchor, her laughter, his light, her face, the only map that still made sense in a world that had lost shape. Mira listened with quiet eyes, her hand steady, her heart open, and when he reached into his coat and took out the ring once more, the one he had shaped in secret across the years, forged from alloy, not for its value but for its story, she did not look away. She saw the etching, the lines carved into the band by his own hand, the same patterns he used to draw with sticks in the soil when they were children, when stars were dreams and dreams were within reach. He held the ring in his palm and asked, not as a formality, not as a custom, but from the deepest place in him, will you be the one who walks with me, not just in peace, but in whatever comes next, in fire or silence, in joy or change? Will you be my path, not because we are broken, not because we are healing, but because we choose to be whole together? And Mira answered, not with a speech, not with flowers or tears, but with one step forward and a single word, always. He slid the ring onto her finger, and in that small movement, the years closed behind them, not forgotten, not erased, but completed. The circle now whole, the promise made not just by a boy beneath the stars, but by the man who returned to keep it, not for pride, not for honor, but for love. People around them watched, some with smiles, some with tears, and none with doubt, for they had seen this love rise not from ease, but from distance and time and silence. They had seen it carry through war, through fear, through the quiet breaking of the universe. And now they saw it rise again, as something unshaken, something that could not be taken. That night, the colony celebrated not with loud music or grand festivals, but with warmth and laughter and long stories shared under open Sky children danced between the firelights, elders sat close to the flames speaking of old days. And New Hope, Mira and Leo sat together beneath the tower, not climbing it now, but resting in its shadow, as if the place itself remembered their promise and had waited. Till later in the quiet hours, as the fire dimmed and the stars brightened, Leo spoke again, this time of what would come next. He told Mira and the council that the message he had sent to Earth had been received not by those who would use it, but by those who would protect it. All eyes not tied to power, but to truth. A new group was forming, a network of voices from forgotten colonies, from silent survivors, from those who had seen what others refused to see, and they needed leaders, not commanders, not rulers, but people who had lived through the dark and still chose light. The council looked to Mira, and Mira looked to Leo, and the two of them knew without words that their path would not be quiet. Their journey had only begun, but now they would walk it together, not out of duty, not out of debt, but out of love rooted deep. And true weeks passed, and the colony began to shift, not in fear, but in preparation. Defenses were checked, systems restored, communication towers aligned with new networks. Mira trained a new group of medics, young and eager to learn. Leo worked with the engineers, building not weapons, but bridges between minds, between systems, between hearts that had once been kept apart, and through it all they remained side by side, not as a symbol, not as a legend, but as two souls who had chosen each other. Again and again, despite everything, one evening as the silver moon rose first, and the blue followed slowly behind, Mira and Leo stood once more at the top of the tower, the wind soft, the sky open, and the stars watching like old friends. And Leo said, "Do you remember when we sat here, and you laughed when I told you I would marry you?" And Mira smiled and said, "I remember, but I was not laughing at the promise. I was only surprised that you said it before I did." They stayed there for a long time, quiet together, as the moons completed their dance, and the night stretched out before them, full of light, full of hope, full of everything still to come, the end.